I woke up groggy, my head pounding like I'd been hit by a freight train. The first thing I noticed was the hard, unforgiving surface under me. Felt like I was lying on a plank of wood. I opened my eyes, but there wasn't a shred of light, just solid, suffocating darkness. Instinctively, I reached out in front of me. My fingers hit wood. I reached to the sides, above, below. Everywhere I touched, it was all the same. Smooth, cold, solid wood. Panic crept up my spine as I ran my hands along what felt like the walls of some kind of box. One that I was trapped inside. I stopped moving for a moment and forced myself to take deep breaths. In and out. In and out. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I needed to figure out what in the world was going on. How had I ended up in here? Did someone stick me in this thing? So who would do that? And where exactly was here? A basement? A warehouse? The middle of nowhere? Questions spun around my head like leaves caught in a tornado. I racked my brain, trying to recall my last memories. The clearest thing I could remember was driving home from work. It had been just another regular evening. I walked into my apartment, quiet as always, fixed myself a quick dinner, and then went to bed. Nothing unusual, nothing weird. It had all been normal, or at least it seemed that way at the time. So what the hell happened? And when? But honestly, none of that mattered right now. What mattered was figuring out where I was and getting the hell out of this box. My eyes strained in the darkness, trying to adjust, but it was so pitch black there wasn't much for them to adjust to. Feeling my way around was my only option. I stretched my arms and legs as much as I could, trying to get a sense of my surroundings. I realized the planks on either side of me weren't far, maybe about 6 inches on each side. My feet were pressed right up against the bottom plank, but there was some space above my head, about a foot, give or take. I could wiggle around a bit, but not much. As for the plank over me, it was close. So close I could barely lift my arms before my knuckles brushed against it. It felt like there were just 3 inches between me and that top board. It was tight, too tight. The air was starting to feel heavy, and every time I inhaled, the space around me seemed to shrink a little more. I pressed my hands against the walls of the box, trying to push my way out. I shoved with everything I had, but it didn't make a bit of difference. Not a single side budged. The wood was as solid and unyielding as a brick wall. Desperation clawed at me, and I started shouting, "Help! Somebody, help me!" My voice rang out, but it sounded wrong, hollow, muffled, like the sound had nowhere to go. It was trapped inside the box with me, bouncing around in the cramped space. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. No one was going to hear me. My cries would never reach the outside world. Panic surged through me like a flood. My breathing quickened, and I couldn't stop myself from pounding on the wood, slamming my fists against the sides and the top. It didn't matter that it hurt. I just needed to do something, anything, to try and break free. When I pounded on the end of the box, near my head, I noticed something odd. The texture, the feel of the wood there, it was different. I stopped hammering for a second and ran my hands over it, more carefully this time. My fingers traced the contours, feeling the way the wood was shaped and joined together. A cold chill ran down my spine as I realized what it was. It wasn't just any box. It was shaped like a coffin. My breath hitched in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears as I ran my hands over the rest of the box, double-checking. The shape was unmistakable, long and narrow, tapered at one end. No doubt about it, I was inside a coffin. That's when the real fear set in. My panic turned into sheer terror. I started pounding again, harder this time, screaming louder than before. My fists ached, but I didn't care. "Let me out. Somebody, please." My voice cracked, and my throat burned from yelling. I pressed my hands against the lid and pushed as hard as I could. I felt my muscles strain, but it was no use. The lid didn't even shift. It was as if it had been nailed shut, or worse, weighted down. A horrifying thought crept into my mind, one that I didn't want to believe but couldn't shake. What if the coffin wasn't above ground? What if it had already been buried? The idea wrapped around me like a vice, squeezing the air from my lungs. If I really was 6 feet under, there'd be no way out. My shouts, my pounding, my efforts, they'd all be for nothing. But I couldn't give up. Not yet. I didn't care how hopeless it seemed. I wasn't ready to accept that this was the end. A flood of new questions surged into my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. How in the world did I end up here? Who could have done this to me? Was this some kind of horrible accident? Had someone mistakenly thought I was dead and buried me alive? Or, even worse, was this intentional? If it was, then why? What could I have possibly done to deserve this? My brain was spiraling, grasping at straws, desperate for answers that weren't coming. Before I could finish the thought, something snapped me out of it. Something that wasn't just the sound of my own frantic breathing or the creak of the wood as I shifted. It was faint, but it was there. A noise. And this time, it wasn't coming from inside the coffin. I froze, straining to hear. It sounded distant, muffled, but unmistakably real, coming from above me. My heart leapt in my chest, a spark of hope flaring for the first time since I woke up in this nightmare. "Help!" I screamed, the word ripping out of me like a roar. I pounded on the lid with everything I had, my knuckles throbbing from the effort. "I'm down here. Somebody, please. I'm alive." My voice cracked as I shouted, but I didn't care. This might be my only chance. The air inside the coffin was growing hotter and heavier by the second, and I could feel the oxygen slipping away with each breath I took. If I didn't get someone's attention soon, it'd be over for me. I couldn't afford to stop, not now. I alternated between shouting and listening, shouting and listening. I'd scream until my lungs burned, then hold my breath and strain to hear any sound from above. Felt like an eternity passed with nothing but silence. And then, finally, I heard it again. Faint sound like dirt shifting. It was so subtle I almost thought I imagined it. But then I heard it again. Someone or something was moving the earth above me. My chest tightened, but this time it wasn't panic. It was hope. Real, fragile hope. For the first time since I'd woken up in this godforsaken box, I allowed myself to believe I might actually have a chance. I took a deep breath, probably one of the last few good ones I'd get, and focused. Whoever or whatever was up there, they weren't moving fast, and I wasn't out of this yet. But at least now I knew I wasn't alone. I kept pounding on the lid, yelling louder and louder, determined to make sure whoever was up there didn't stop digging. My fists were raw, and my voice was hoarse, but I didn't care. I wasn't about to let this chance slip away. The sound of digging grew louder, more distinct, and I could feel the vibrations in the coffin now. The tiny flicker of hope I'd been holding on to began to grow, warming me from the inside. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than fear. I even let out a shaky laugh and found myself smiling. Just a little. They were close, so close now that the scraping and shifting dirt seemed to be right on top of me. I held my breath, waiting for that moment, the one where the lid would finally open, and I'd see light, or at least someone's face peering down at me. My heart was pounding, and my fingers twitched with anticipation. Then it happened. A sound so sweet, it nearly brought tears to my eyes. A knock. Not from me this time, this one came from the other side of the lid. Someone had found me. "I'm here," I shouted, my voice cracking from relief and exhaustion. "I'm inside the coffin. Please hurry." I waited, holding my breath, listening intently. The next thing I heard was the faint creak of the lid being pushed open. A sliver of air rushed in, and for a split second, I thought I'd been saved. But just as quickly as it opened, the lid slammed shut again. "Hey!" I shouted, my hope faltering for a moment. "Are you okay up there? Do you need help or something?" No response. Not a word. Just silence. My heart sank, but I wasn't ready to give up yet. Maybe the lid was heavier than it seemed. Maybe whoever was up there was just catching their breath. "Hey! Can you hear me?" I called out again, my voice echoing in the tight space. "I'm still down here. Don't leave me." I stared at the darkness, waiting for the lid to lift again. My hope hadn't vanished, but now it felt fragile, teetering on the edge of despair. Whoever was up there had found me, I just needed them to finish the job. I braced my hands against the lid, pushing with every ounce of strength I had left. At first, it didn't seem like it was going to give. But then, to my surprise, it shifted. The lid moved. Encouraged, I shoved harder, and with a final burst of effort, I pushed it completely off. Cool, fresh air rushed in, filling my lungs, and I gasped, savoring the sensation. Even though it was the dead of night, the moonlight pouring in was so bright it felt blinding. I squinted, shutting my eyes tight for a moment, letting them adjust to the sudden change. When I finally opened them, I looked up, desperate to see my rescuer, the person who had dug me out of what should have been my grave. And there he was, standing right over me. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. Something was wrong, very wrong. His mouth was foaming, thick and frothy, spilling down his chin. He made these horrible sounds, a mix of moaning and wheezing, like he was in some kind of unbearable pain. His arms and legs jutted out at unnatural angles, as if they'd been snapped and never set right again. And his face, God, his face. It moved, but not like a normal face. It twitched and contorted, like something alive was trapped inside his skin, trying to escape. His entire body looked like it was barely holding itself together. His skin sagged and stretched over bones that didn't seem to fit right, and chunks of it were missing entirely. He looked fragile, like a stiff wind could blow him apart. But there was nothing weak about the way he loomed over me, staring down with lifeless eyes that burned with some kind of terrifying intent. I froze, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. And then it hit me, like a bucket of ice water dumped over my head. This wasn't a person, not anymore. This was a zombie. Before I could even begin to process what that meant, he lunged. The thing dropped onto me with a sickening speed, and the weight of him knocked the air out of my lungs. His hands, twisted and claw-like, tore at me relentlessly. My skin burned as he ripped and scratched at my arms, my chest, my face, anywhere he could reach. I screamed, but it didn't matter. I fought back as hard as I could, but my punches landed like I was hitting a bag of brittle bones and rotted flesh. It didn't stop him. Nothing I did seemed to matter. What happened next? Well, no one really knows. Maybe I fought until I couldn't anymore. Maybe I screamed until my voice gave out. But one thing is for sure, I never made it out of that grave alive.